Faultline Syria, Russia and America both in the air, both bombing, but hardly talking as the battle temperature rises.
Looks like a terrorist, if it acts like a terrorist, if it walks like a terrorist, if it fights like a terrorist, it's a terrorist, right?
Good evening at what appears to be a new high watermark in the devastating conflict in Syria. Russia is no longer simply aiding Syria into the air and onto the battlefield, but now joining the fight for herself. America somehow discombobulated about what to do. Their own pilots having to avoid hitting the Russians, whilst they accuse Moscow of hitting rebel forces that the US itself has trained. Tonight, we devote much of this programme to trying to understand what is happening in Syria and at the implications for the rest of us.
I'm in the Syrian government stronghold of Tartus, where people have been telling me they see Vladimir Putin as their saviour.
And I'm in the German city of Munich, a place which extended an iconic welcome to tens of thousands of Syrian refugees in the last month, but where the tide of generosity is now beginning to turn.
Also tonight, the Islamic State's child soldiers, the young being trained for the battlefield and suicide missions, and the 14-year-olds savagely punished for refusing to join up. And, as the world reels at the new Russian involvement, a startling view of the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, from which US pilots have launched hundreds of sorties. We're aboard, as close as anyone gets to America's Syrian war effort.
The aircrew are very professional, they're well trained, they certainly know how to operate their aircraft, but they're human beings too, and they understand that and when they launch off of here, it's war.
Day 2 of Russia bombing Syria. With Moscow and Washington now both involved, the world is staring in on Syria. After a summer which saw the Syrian crisis move to Europe's shores with wave after wave of migrants and refugees, could Russia's intervention bring a solution or make bad situations worse? Whilst both superpowers have a common enemy, the so-called Islamic State, Putin sees Syria's President Assad as a valiant defender against the terrorists, whilst Obama sees him as a tyrant who slaughters his own people. Just days after the pair shook hands at the United Nations, what does the future hold? Tonight, we're live in Tartus, Syria, the port city where the Russians are gathering their forces, in Germany, the great magnet drawing Syrian refugees, and in Washington, where a wrong-footed administration is scrabbling for a response. But first, our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, with the latest on the Russian airstrikes.
If you don't know the script by now, you should. The British, the US and the Russians do the same in time of war. 1. Invite your own national TV to film the bombers going out in Syria. 2. Supply cockpit video without any proof that what is being hit is what they say is being hit. 3. Send out a uniform to tell the world every bomb hit the target, no civilians killed. London, Washington, and now Moscow. The song remains the same. And Russia's English language channel ready to pump it out.
A direct airstrike has destroyed an explosives plant to the north of the city of Homs. This plant was used to pack vehicles with explosives that were later involved in terrorist acts, including suicide attacks.
Day 2 of America and Russia bombing Syria. Both superpowers agreed that talking air traffic control might be a good idea. They held a joint military video conference late this afternoon, but only after Senator John McCain had accused Russia of targeting rebels who'd been trained by the CIA. And on the ground, the ever-suffering Syrians, of course, sensing newer, bigger bombs and keen to point the finger.
See how these explosions are totally different from the Syrian ones before? The Russian jets are still circling in the sky.
Well, verifying who creates what explosion, where and when in the Syrian propaganda storm is next to impossible. But the Russians are bombing, with, they say, more than 50 helicopters and warplanes deployed. To them, every anti-Assad fighter is a dangerous Islamic terrorist.
If it looks like a terrorist, if it acts like a terrorist, if it walks like a terrorist, if it fights like a terrorist, it's a terrorist, right? I would recall that we always were saying that we are going to fight ISIL and other terrorist groups. This is the same position which the Americans are taking.
But right now, tonight, Sergei and the boss Vladimir have one big problem. They claim they're bombing IS and other Islamic rebels because to Russia they're all the same. But they can't furnish any proof that IS is being bombed at all. Russian officials said today they bombed Idlib city in the north, an ammunition dump and bomb factory, Hama city further south, an administration position, and just to the north of Homs, an ammunition and bomb factory. These are not IS areas, but areas north of Homs, from where anti-Assad groups are pushing out west, and from Idlib in the north, where anti-Assad rebels are pushing southwest. Both offensives now threaten Tartus and Latakia, coastal areas loyal to Assad, but where the Russians also have their naval and air bases. And IS, where are they in all this? Well, their heartland is miles away to the east and far north of Syria. Where there is Syria and Russians, there will likely be Iranians too. Reports today that hundreds of Iranian soldiers now preparing to push north with President Assad's forces under the air support from Russia. Oh, and don't forget that Russians also have ground forces too, who will not be fighting, or so President Putin tells us.
The Russians have got at least 2 battalions on the ground. They've got a marine battalion at Tartus, the port, and they've got a battalion task group at Latakia, which is the airfield, and they've got there a tank company, they've got rifle companies, they've got artillery, so they're not just operating in the air, although they've started to do that. It looks as if the build-up is to give them at least the option of operating on the ground.
Video released by the Russian Defense Ministry purports to show Sukhoi fighter bombers returning to base. Commander-in-Chief Putin will know very well what Assad and Obama have learned the hard way. You cannot remove militias from the air in Syria. And what will Putin do then?
Alex Thompson reporting, well, there are many in President Assad's stronghold who have welcomed the Russian airstrikes. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, joins us now live from Tartus on Syria's Mediterranean coast, where there's a large Russian naval base. Lindsay.
John, people here don't care if the Russians hit the Islamic State or any other rebel group fighting against President Bashar al-Assad. As far as they're concerned, if they're against the government, they're all terrorists. That's what I found out when I went out to talk to people this morning. Some have been displaced by war from other cities. Others were born here in Tartus. Either way, in the souk this morning, sentiment was clear. What do you think about Russia, Putin?
Oh, very, 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 very good.
Very, very good.
Very, very.
You like Russia?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Putin is the source of justice, he says. Putin? The king. The king. Putin is the king. The view here seems to be unanimous. This is really the heartland of President Bashar al-Assad's power. And people I've been speaking to say the Russians are their brothers, and they're hoping that these airstrikes mean the beginning of the end of the war. Enthusiasm for Russian airstrikes is fueled by desperation.
If Satan comes here to save us from those terrorists, I'd welcome him.
Tartus is a holiday resort for Syria's dwindling middle class. But just down the coast from the cargo vessels are warships docked at the Russian naval base, where they bring in much of the hardware they're using now. The governor told me he's sure Russia will have an impact on the Islamic State or Daesh.
We can see that the Russians are determined to defeat Daesh and the terrorists, whereas by contrast, the Americans and their coalition don't seem to have the same determination. In the last year, they said they were fighting terrorism, but Daesh grew stronger, not weaker, so we can say their coalition is not serious.
The Martyrs' Wall, for the young men who've died fighting for this government. He lost a cousin.
They should have done this earlier. We were under pressure for a long time, and the army did their best. But more than 80 countries are fighting us, and we lost many loved ones. I believe it's the Russians, not the Arabs, who are our brothers.
She lost a nephew.
I'm very pleased. Maybe this will bring results and Syria will be beautiful, like it used to be.
Here they see all their martyrs as victims of terrorism. They're not talking about negotiation or compromise, but now with Russian help, victory. The danger is, though, that it won't bring the end of the war closer. It'll lead to an escalation. Already there are reports that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are funneling more funds and arms to their proxies fighting against the government here. You've got the Iranian forces who are going to use Russian air cover to back up President Bashar al-Assad. And you could get more radicalization amongst the forces ranged against him. This could get a whole lot worse. But of course, when you look at President Putin and what he's trying to do, it's not just about Syria. He's also trying to show that he has a legitimacy in what he's doing that he says the Americans haven't. After all, it's the Syrian government which has invited him to come in and start using his air force, whereas the Americans are bombing Islamic State without such an invitation. Maybe what he's going to do next is try and bring forward a UN Security Council resolution, and then if the West vetoes it or doesn't or abstains, he'll say, well, look, we're trying to be against the terrorists. So this is not just about Syria. It's about Vladimir Putin trying to show that Russia is the essential nation and he is the essential leader.
Lindsay Hilsum in Tartus in Syria. We're joined now from Moscow by the former Russian MP Natalia Nanonetskaya and by Yasmin Nahlawi from the Manchester-based Syrian organisation Rethink, Rebuild. Natalia Nanonetskaya, what do you read as being Russia's purpose in bombing right now? Why not before now? And what is the ambition now?
Well, personally, I regret that it hasn't been done before the situation with ISIL became so aggravating and threatening the whole world. I see the purpose as such. Russia wants to reinforce the Syrian army, which we take as the only legitimate party in the conflict, with such arms as aviation, which the Syrian army lacks. And also, I've heard by the experts, but not by the officials, of course, I emphasize that it would be also wise to reinforce the Kurds army, because it's rather effective but not fully equipped and organized. The purpose is to at least to weaken the ISIL to the point that it cannot expand anymore. And that would give the Syrian government the chance to talk to the opposition, because we have been never against such negotiations. And we also think, and I think Russian government and leadership believes that this engagement and this action on the part of Russia will promote and induce and encourage Americans to return to the working relations with Russia, which is only to the benefit of
let me interrupt.
Not only.
Let me interrupt you there. Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive answer. But let me put it to you, Natalia Nanonetskaya, Yasmin Nahlawi. Let me put it to you that what we have here, therefore, is Russia saying, we're here to defeat ISIL. That's what you want too.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm very disappointed in what I just heard. She just described Assad as the only legitimate party in the Syrian conflict. She's talking about someone who is responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And from another premise, I have to say, to say that going after Assad or going after ISIS is going after terrorism is forgetting that Assad is actually responsible for this very terrorism. Assad is responsible for the root cause of the conflict. If you take the total number of deaths in Syria over the past 4 years, the Assad regime has been responsible for over 95% of the deaths. So when we're talking about how do we alleviate the conflict in Syria, how do we alleviate radicalism and terrorism, we have to remember that the Assad regime is the #1 terrorist group inside Syria operating right now. So as Syrians, the way we see moving forward is without a no-fly zone, which protects people from the brutality of the Assad regime, which protects us from airstrikes, from barrel bombs, from chemical weapons that are employed against the Assad regime, that we don't see a way forward.
Let me put that to Natalia Nalinarovskaya, because, I mean, it is beyond question that we have in President Assad somebody who has killed enormous numbers of his own people. Is Russia really happy to back that situation?
President Assad offered the negotiations with the opposition before opposition went to the streets, because Assad understood very well after Libya that he will be the next, because the strategy of the West was clear, to crush the pillar states of the Middle East. But I must tell you that the data shows that the atrocities of militants on the occupied territories have outdone 1,000 times all the sins of Assad regime. And, you know, of course, the Assad regime, absolutely, we are not idolizing it at all. And we understand that it was an authoritarian regime. But spoiling the image of oneself by acts against opposition, etc., it doesn't shrink the sovereignty, and this is legitimate government.
Natalia, let me just put that.
We are in diplomatic relations with Syria.
Let me just put that.
Is occupying place in the General Assembly, and nobody contests that. It's
all right,
only some
let me
Western
put what you've said to our Syrian opposition activist, Yasmin Nahlawi. You answer those points.
Yeah, well, first of all, she made the point that the opposition groups are killing many times more than the Assad regime, and I'd just like to dispute that factual point that the Assad regime, according to the Syrian Network on Human Rights, the Assad regime is responsible for over 95% of the deaths in Syria. Now, I want to also make one thing clear, that as Syrians, we absolutely condemn ISIS and everything to do with ISIS. And ISIS is a foreign ideology, and there is no one who would like to see ISIS out of Syria more than we do. But at the same time, we recognize that ISIS is not going to go unless we address the underlying root cause of the problem, which is the Assad regime. President Assad, or the Assad regime, in terrorizing, in destroying, in attacking his people, has created the conditions for groups such as ISIS to take hold in Syria. And even if the Americans, the Russians, sorry, just as a one final point, even if they were successful between today and tomorrow to eliminate ISIS, the conditions on the ground because of the Assad regime means that we'll have another ISIS in Syria from the next day.
Yasmin Nahlawi, I must end it there, but thank you very much for joining us. And Natalia Nalinarovskaya, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Moscow. Well, one of the concerns of the Russian offensive is that it will prompt a new wave of bombed and displaced people to attempt the perilous journey to Europe. Germany has become a magnet for hundreds of thousands of Syrians since declaring that refugees were welcome, but our attitude's now hardening. Our Europe editor, Matt Fry, is in Munich tonight. Matt.
Well, John, just a few weeks ago, as you may remember, this station here in Munich was absolutely jam-packed with thousands of refugees, mainly Syrians and some economic migrants as well, coming across from Austria and from Hungary. That stream has now been reduced to a trickle because the borders have gone up. The Germans, like everyone else, have imposed restrictions because there is a feeling that they simply cannot handle that enormous tide. Having said that, though, John, this country took in 250,000 refugees last month alone, and this city houses more refugees than Britain will accommodate in the next 4 years. In this particular week of the Oktoberfest, all that makes for a rather interesting culture clash. You could be excused for thinking that you've landed on a strange planet, especially if you're a Syrian refugee and you walk into this in the center of Munich, a mere beer bottle's throw from the train station. The annual Oktoberfest, Disney with lederhosen and supersized beers. This is Bavaria's celebration of excess. The beer halls are the size of aircraft hangars. Beer is served in something bigger than a flower vase, and pork is king, on the plates and on the walls. A few weeks ago, the city authorities briefly flirted with the idea of cancelling this annual bacchanalia out of respect for the refugees who were being given standing ovations at the train station. But that would have gone down very badly, and since then the mood here has shifted against the visitors from another world. I met Hans Fuhrbach, a retired maths and physics teacher. The rest of the world is impressed by the hospitality of Germans towards outsiders.
I'm not so happy about that.
You're not happy about it? Why not?
Too much people, and all the Muslim people. They will throw us out.
They will throw you out? They can't throw you out. There are 89 million of you.
Every year we lose 200,000 Germans and get 400,000 Muslims more.
So you think there's a danger the Muslims will take over in this country?
Yeah, they take over. I'm very sure about that. Yeah, very sure.
So what would you do about this refugee problem then?
No, I don't vote for Merkel again. Never.
You voted for Merkel?
Yes, but I'll never do that again.
Because of this?
Yeah.
And still they come, despite the fact that Germany reimposed border controls with Austria 2 weeks ago. This is Passau, while Germany's economic miracle in the form of newly minted Mercedes Jeeps screeches by. The refugees line the platform, waiting to be processed. There is friction amongst the newcomers. The police step in before a brawl can erupt. Aladdin is an English teacher from Aleppo. His 6-year-old and only son died in a barrel bombing. He's been a refugee for a year, documenting every step of his nomadic existence on his smartphone.
We need a solution.
Yeah.
Killing is not a solution.
So Putin getting involved is not a solution?
Yeah. No, it's involved.
So
in all time, Russia helped Assad.
Yeah.
But now, bomb, more bomb.
It means more war?
Yeah, more war.
More refugees?
Yeah.
So what's your future going to be? What's your future?
I don't know my future. I don't. I waste my future.
Passau has welcomed 17,000 refugees in 1 week alone. That's a third of its entire population, and almost as many as the whole of Britain will accommodate in 4 years. It is said that down the end of the train line, Angela Merkel, a pastor's daughter, is using the refugees to turn Germany into a moral superpower. But her own party is now worried about a backlash. And here at the Passau Tavern, opinions are divided, in this case, in one family.
It's not like in the first days where there were a lot of people standing at the railway station with all these signs saying welcome to Germany, etc. That's more or less gone. But I also don't see any people saying please go away again. So people are getting used to it, I have the impression.
So what do you think? Is it too many? Yes, far too many, Evelyn, the mother, told me. We have no idea how to cope with these numbers. Angela Merkel's moral exceptionalism regarding refugees stems in part from Germany's exceptionally dark past, and nowhere is this more poignant than here. This was the main camp at Dachau. Dachau, one of the first and most infamous camps built by the Nazis. They killed more than 40,000 prisoners here. And here's the really bitter irony. Such is the lack of accommodation and space for the refugees flooding into Germany now, that quite a few of them have been put up by the authorities in another part of the camp, just across the road. The SS called this piece of hell the Herb Garden. They used the camp's prisoners as slave labour to help develop a Nazi brand of homeopathic medicine. These are the original greenhouses. It's a grotesque notion lost on Jovid and Shafi, both refugees from Afghanistan, who now call this place home. Inside, all traces of the past have long been erased. So how do they feel about the history of this place?
So
what Jovid says basically is that he doesn't really care that this was a concentration camp, which he's now staying in, because it's better than sleeping on the street, and there are no rooms, there are no flats available anymore in Germany because there's simply too many refugees like him. So he's happy to have this place and doesn't mind too much that it's in a rather creepy location. Both are relieved that Germany has offered them refuge, but they're also sick with longing for the country they lost. And the same probably goes for all of them, waiting in Munich to start the rest of their lives. Every European country is grappling in different ways with its numbers, its conscience and its politics. But as the brief summer of altruism comes to an end, it is Germany that will be remembered for setting the moral standard. And that surely is a first. I should point out that the authorities in the small town of Dachau are not happy that refugees are being put up in this particular location, but as they point out, we simply have nowhere else to put them. There really is an extraordinary pressure of numbers here, and the German authorities are doing their very best to accommodate everyone. And what's really interesting is that the Chancellor Angela Merkel seems to be out on a limb almost by herself here, because the rest of her cabinet has expressed their concerns about this. The rest of the ruling party and the ruling coalition are not very happy about it. The opinion polls seem to be punishing her a little bit. And it's really interesting why she's decided to do this. Is it because she has no children herself and therefore she feels needs to give something back to society, as one commentator suggested? Is it because she's the daughter of a pastor? The point is that this is for Angela Merkel, who's always been a very cautious politician, a key point, a litmus test of not just Germany's morality, but also Europe's morality. Back to you, John.
Matt Fry in Munich. There is one group on the ground that all the other key players see as a common enemy, ISIS. Now disturbing new evidence of the systematic mass recruitment of children in Syria and Iraq to fight for so-called Islamic State has been uncovered by Channel 4 News. Thousands of children, some as young as 8, are being taught how to fight, how to die in the name of jihad for ISIS. And the price of resisting? The public mutilation of children who refuse to join them. And a warning, this film from Evan Williams contains some very distressing testimony from children that may upset some viewers.
These pictures show the so-called Islamic State creating a new army in Syria and Iraq. Channel 4 News has gathered the first evidence of a systematic campaign to embed ISIS ideology into the next generation, including the recruitment of children as young as 8 as soldiers and suicide bombers. We speak to a 15-year-old boy who's just been through ISIS military training.
لأنها كانت في نظري دولة مظلومة يجب أن تفديها ولو بنفسك.
To an ISIS teacher who prepared children for death.
يحكون وكلهم يعني أطفال صغار فكلهم يجاهدون. فأكثر شيء كان اعتمادهم على الأطفال.
And a boy soldier who paid a terrible price for resisting. Told for the first time, this is the shocking and sometimes bizarre world of the caliphate, where young children are being taught how to kill and how to die. The so-called Islamic State has tens of thousands of children under its control. Children they are now actively recruiting as their next generation of fighters. 10-year-old Hamoud was one of them.
قالوا نضرب قالوا ما صار تضربون بالأسلحة بس اطلقون وتفكفكون فكفكناهن قالوا مركبوهن ركبناهن وسويناهن عاد قالوا نحطوهن على الحائط.
Getting more information about ISIS military training isn't easy. Thousands of Syrian refugees now live in Turkish border towns, but ISIS is here too. Ever since we've arrived, people have been telling us how there are Islamic State sympathisers among the Syrians living here in Turkey. That means that most of them are too afraid to speak to us. But some children were willing to speak out on condition of anonymity. At 14, Abu Ibrahim, not his real name, joined the ISIS army after they convinced him they were pure Muslims.
ويجب أن أقدم كل ما لدي لأنصر هذه الدولة لأنها كانت في نظري دولة مظلومة يجب أن تفديها ولو بنفسك.
But when they threatened to kill his brother, Abu Ibrahim lost faith in ISIS and fled. ISIS videos show children being put through rigorous physical training. But Abu Ibrahim says they're also being taught something much more dangerous.
في هذا المعسكر الشرعي تتعلم شيء اسمه السمع والطاعة. تقول يجب أن أسمع وأطيع لو أني سأموت. يجب أن أتدرب. دائما يكرر هذه الكلمتين السمع والطاعة.
ISIS calls these children cubs of the caliphate. Abu Ibrahim says from what he and others saw, thousands of children are being systematically recruited across ISIS-controlled territory into the 3 different units of the ISIS army, and that children are central to its long-term strategic plan.
جيش يسمى على 3 تقسيمات: جيش ولاية وجيش خلافة وجيش يسمى جيش العدناني.
This ISIS video shows what Abu Ibrahim calls the second stage of basic training for children, where they're further coerced to commit violence. All of this seemingly unaffected by hundreds of coalition airstrikes. It's physically hard, but the main aim is to create a new army of unquestioning and what ISIS deems ideologically pure fighters.
فهم ينمون جيل الخلافة ومحاربة الناس ومحاربة الكفار بينهم لديه الولاء المطلق من هذه اللحظة.
It's that loyalty that ISIS is exploiting for another horrifying purpose. It starts with showing the children videos of suicide attacks.
فعندما تتكرر المشاهد مرة مرتين إلى عدة مرات فيصبح لدي أو لدى أي إنسان شعور بأني سأفعل كما فعل الشخص الذي قبلي، فيذهبون إلى الدولة يقولون نحن نريد أن ننفذ عمليات.
And how young would be the youngest boy that wants to be a suicide bomber that you saw?
نفذ بهم شخص عمره 8 سنوات.
8. He's just a child.
ولم تستطيع أن تقنعه بأن يتخلى عن فكرته.
Getting young children to sacrifice their lives without question requires intensive indoctrination. We tracked down an insider who is in charge of that process. Until just a few weeks before we met her, Emil was an ISIS teacher who prepared girls as young as 10 to seek death.
كنا نحرضهم على الجهاد ونعطيهم إنه كلياتنا رايح نروح شهداء على الجنة كلياتنا يعني، فلازم الجهاد مذكور بالقرآن، الجهاد في سبيل الله، فلازم كلياتنا نروح نجاهد في سبيل الله ومشان الوطن يعني كمان.
She too narrowly escaped after becoming disillusioned by the scale of the violence.
كانت أكثر شيء إنه تفهمهم إنه يعني دولة بشار هي كافرة ولازم نحارب، كل واحد يحاربنا وضد، لازم نعلي كلمة الله، وصول غسل عقول للأطفال الصغار.
These boys have also recently escaped ISIS-controlled Syria. Now in Turkey, they attend weekly de-radicalization classes to counter the influence of Islamic State indoctrination.
يجي منفوت على الجامعة يقول لنا أنتوا بتصلوا؟ نقول له إيه. يقولوا لنا تحبون البغدادي؟ نقول لهم إيه. يقولوا لهم أنتوا تحبون البغدادي؟ نقول لهم إيه أكيد. يقولون إيه. وأنتوا تعرفون حدا يعني يقرب لكم شيء؟ نقول لهم ما نعرف.
Children are then taught to spy on their parents, who risk death if they object to their children joining the ISIS army. Boys are then routinely gathered in town squares. Here, they're offered money and food to join ISIS and fed anti-Western tirades. 10-year-old Bashir, also not his real name, was among them.
لما يجمعونهم هيك ويحجون معاهم إنه تعالوا معانا وهاي يقولوا لهم مثلا تعالوا جاهدوا في سبيل الله راح تفوتون الجنة والمدري شكون وآخر شيء يعني راح تكيفون وراح نعطيكم كم شغلات وهيك.
Boys are then sat in front of big screens and forced to watch videos of ISIS brutality. Propaganda films like this one, which shows the execution of Syrian soldiers in Palmyra.
يطلعوا لنا غير عنا جنود بشار شلون يذبحون.
Ahmed is 11.
بعض نوبات ما نحضرها وإذا حضرناها نخاف منها.
They say they're often forced to watch real executions too.
إنه يحشد لدخول مدينة تضمر ونقول له هيهات هيهات.
But perhaps most disturbingly of all, ISIS releases videos showing these executions are increasingly being carried out by the boys themselves. Like this boy who beheaded a Syrian officer in January. Or this one in which a boy apparently executes 2 alleged Russian spies. Boys are told they too will be killed if they don't join ISIS by age 16. But death is not the only punishment for refusing to join ISIS. Omar is 14. He'd been serving with more moderate opposition forces. ISIS fighters captured and then tortured him to try to force him to join them.
بالسجن ظلت شهر ونص يعني تحت التعذيب ومشبوح. انك ليش ما تبايع الدولة وليش ما تبايعنا؟ وليش ما تقاتل النصيرية معانا؟ ليش ذبحوا نص المسلمين.
He refused to join and was sentenced to a horrifying punishment.
لموا العالم كلياته جدا بالعالم لفوا لي من هنا ورجلي كمان وخدروها تخدير وكمان زاد رجلي تخدير. حطيت ايدي على الخشبة وبسطوا رقصوا لي ايدي لفوا لي اياها بعدين زاد رجلي كذلك زاد قصوها ولفوا لي اياها.
These photos show Omar's actual amputation. And the man known as the bulldozer who severed his limbs. Omar's amputations were carried out just 3 weeks before we met him. He'd escaped Syria only days before. The price of his bravery is constant pain, depression and poverty.
من ننزل جو ما اطلع لليل مشان اني متعبه من الدرج. من يعني قطعوا لي يدي ورجلي طابت نفسي من الحياه. ما ظل ما اقدر لا امشي لا شيء.
Omar's public punishment was used as a warning to children not to resist ISIS.
جابوا أطفال وشباب لما هو العالم إنه هذا كافر مرتد حكمنا عليه قص اليد ورجله وقص إيده ورجله. كل شيء واحد يقاتل دولة الإسلام بإذن الله لا نقصه لا نقص إيده ورجله.
The message this new ISIS army of children receives is that the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad is the main target for now. But as their own videos reveal, their long-term plan is to attack the West whenever possible.
هم يعني بالمستقبل راح يخربون يعني كثير دول راح يخربون يعني ويسوون تفجيرات لأنه هم عندهم مخططات لتفجيرات وكذا بس إن شاء الله راح تفشل يعني.
And that film was produced and directed by Evan Williams. Well, with me now to discuss the role of the United States in Syria is Matthew Barson, the US ambassador to the United Kingdom. And who needs more than what we've had to weather in that film to know just the appalling threat that ISIS represents? But the question must be, if both Russia and the United States understand the scale of the ISIS threat, why are you not able to talk about it in a really comprehensive way?
Well, we are talking about it, and I think you saw President Obama and President Putin talk at the beginning of this week.
Frostily.
You've seen Secretary Kerry and his counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov, talk. We have their defense leadership, our defense leadership, talking around deconflicting. So we are talking. We have to talk, and we have to act, and that's what we're doing, acting against the atrocities you've just seen that ISIL's committing with 65 other countries, including the UK. And we need to act diplomatically and politically to build a political solution to bring security and stability to Syria.
But in the region, it doesn't feel like that because, for example, the United States has accused the Russians of hitting some of the forces that they've actually trained. And at the same time, we had this feeling over this last 36 hours that basically the Russians had decided what they were going to do, and they were going to do it whether you liked it or not.
Well, I think there's a role that Russia can play, a very constructive role on these two distinct but overlapping challenges, one being ISIL, the other being a political solution in Syria. So we welcome, and the president said this, if Russia wants to join with those other 65 other countries and work together in coalition to defeat and degrade ISIL, absolutely, we need their help there. We also need their help. I mean, it's well known to everybody that Syria is a client state of theirs. They've propped up Assad for a long time. They could be helpful in a political transition to get Syria to a better place politically, not militarily. So the concern is they could be constructive in both those areas. They could also be extremely counterproductive if their goal is just to prop up Assad, because he makes both situations worse.
But are we wrong to fear that basically you have America and Russia at war in a theatre in which there is not the greatest possible coordination between them? The real fear that one could hit the other.
But remember, I mean, John, this was the discussion between President Obama and President Putin on Monday, talking a lot. They talked about a lot of things, but conflicting was a major topic to avoid precisely what you're talking about.
So how do we move forward? I mean, do you have to accept for the time being that evils there are, and the lesser of the two is probably the man who's killed his own people, Assad, and the greater is ISIS, and that perhaps ISIS is what has to be concentrated upon?
No, we reject that. And we reject that clearly because I don't think we have to choose between terrorism and tyranny. There is an alternative to those. And I thought it was telling that President Obama stood up in front of his fellow world leaders at the General Assembly and talked about the 70-year journey that we've been on to do precisely that. There is another choice. It's hard, it's slow, but we can make slow, steady, and important progress. And in the case of Syria, with all the tragedies we've seen, not just what you've shown there, but the humanitarian chaos that's been created and millions of lives disrupted. But we are acting, we have been acting, we need to continue to act with great urgency.
But there are elements that you only have a tender relationship with. Iran, for example, we don't really know now quite what the Russian-Tehran axis might be. I mean, we think the Iranians may be in the theatre.
Well, look, I mean, I think we know what we want, right? And if you listen to the words coming from Russia today, they seem to be saying the right things. And the key thing is, are they doing the right things in each of those areas? A, to combat ISIL, and B, to get to a political transition in Syria. We know what of Syria that is whole, that is secure, that's stable, that's pluralistic. That's the goal. Now, how do you get there? What's that process?
That, of course, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
that is
and all the details of how, we don't know, candidly, but we're going to get that by engaging with Russia, by engaging with others in the neighborhood. We've talked about that openly. That's the work ahead of us. That's the work we have to do.
Ambassador, I hate to visit something on you which has happened during this program, which is that we've learned that there's been the most appalling killing in the United States. It appears now that the reports are saying 15 people dead in this community school in Oregon from a mass shooting. And one is bound to ask, I mean, President Obama has said he's against, he wants to tighten gun control, but this is crazy.
Well, I just learned about it as I walked into your studio, so I don't know the details. Obviously, my heart and the American people's heart goes out to the victims and their families, and I don't know the details. What we do know is that this happens too much in our country, and President Obama has talked a lot about it, and he's tried to put forward proposals to reduce gun violence. And the fact is, every American who's learning this news that we just learned is horrified by gun violence. Nobody likes it. Now, what we're going to go do to change it, President Obama has some proposals. We are fighting that out in our democracy. We haven't gotten there yet. Whatever we do won't reduce them all. President Obama knows that. We know that. But we need to do something, and that's what he's fighting so hard for.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for coming in and for talking about both these subjects.
Thanks
and we
for
will
having me.
have more on that breaking news later in the programme. After the break, an astonishing film by the artist Richard Moss aboard the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, based in the Gulf, as it sends out warplanes to bomb IS fighters. Russian bombing offensive has dominated headlines in recent days, but the United States began their round-the-clock campaign against so-called Islamic State 1 year ago. The US aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, based in the Gulf, daily sends out warplanes to bomb ISIS. Artist Richard Moss spent 24 hours with them to record an astonishing and unique view of life on board.
One of the things that's the most exhilarating about the flying up there is when you hear the words stand by for a target, and you get ready. You know that you're about to get ready to start dropping. I think what comes to rest in a lot of pilots' minds is they're ultimately responsible for that bomb that's about to come off the target. So one of the common phrases, it's hours and hours of boredom separated by moments of sheer terror.
Aircraft carrier is sort of a floating city. We're powered by 2 nuclear reactors, and we have our own mobile airport here on the aircraft carrier. We have about 65 airplanes out there, and every week I take on between 600,000 and 900,000 gallons of fuel. And I can tell you that since we've been out here on our deployment, that we've burned through over 10 million. It's quite a bit.
We typically refer to it as 4.5 acres of sovereign U.S. territory.
Initially, when a dynamic situation like this comes on, the Navy has the unique ability of being on sovereign U.S. territory here on board the aircraft carrier, and we can launch combat sorties immediately and prior to having set up all the standard of forces agreements with other countries to launch combat sorties out of their country. So the U.S. Navy began these operations about a year ago. And perhaps the most visible is support for Operation Inherent Resolve, which is primarily air support up into northern Iraq and Syria, supporting primarily the Iraqi security forces and also the Kurdish forces in northern Iraq and in Syria in an effort to deny, degrade, and ultimately destroy ISIS.
So how many pounds in total have you dropped?
I believe the total is about 725,000 pounds of ordnance that has been delivered, so it's quite a bit.
They started operations here in the Gulf on the 16th of April this year. And during that time frame, they've had 1,382 combat missions, and they've dropped 808 bombs. The human element comes into this every single day. And the fact that the air crew, when they man up the airplanes, they realize that the bombs that they're putting down are bombs that are supposed to go to a specific target and do destruction on the enemy. And the air crew are very professional, they're well trained, they certainly know how to operate their aircraft. But they're human beings too, and they understand that and when they launch off of here, it's war.
Do you feel like you're at war?
Absolutely. You know, if we came over here and were dropping bombs that did not have that attitude, then I think we would be mistaken.
You know, there's a sense of satisfaction. I guess that's probably the best word. You go on a long mission. It's 7 hours in a very small cockpit. It's a sense of satisfaction doing a job. But even when you don't do the job, there is a sense of satisfaction. But there's still a little bit of like disappointment that there wasn't a target available for you when you were there. So our guys are excited to drop weapons and support the guys on the ground.
That film was made by Richard Moss, Trevor Tweeton and Ben Frost. Well, as we just heard from the American ambassador, the US has condemned Russia's entry into the Syrian conflict. US officials fear their shared goal of defeating so-called Islamic State is being used by President Putin as a means of removing those opposed to the Syrian president, Mr. Assad, and his regime. Our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, joins us now from the US Senate. Kylie, militarily, the US has shifted its position on Syria?
Well, no. I mean, militarily, there have been discussions today, we know, between the Russians and the US. There was an hour-long video link that is aimed, we're told, at deconflicting the situation, which basically means that there will be efforts made to ensure that no Russian or coalition airplanes get too close above Syrian airspace. But beyond that, there has been no change. Flights are still taking off from the USS Theodore Roosevelt, targeting the Islamic State inside Iraq and inside Syria. The administration, for its part, on Russia today has said, look, the Russians are their own worst enemy, that Assad is not a viable leader, and that they are inviting a new wave of extremism. But that is not the same as having your own viable policy. And critics here are saying the question should be, what will the US do about this? But rather than that, it is simply a matter of, is the US compelled to do anything differently? We could be sliding into a situation where the regime stays in place. There's some kind of political conditional agreement that might allow some protection to civilians. But otherwise, you have multiple parallel wars involving Russia, Iran, and the US, all being conducted inside Syria.
Now, Kylie, as we discussed with the US ambassador just now, there's been this appalling shooting in Oregon, out there on the west coast of America. What do you know?
Well, I only have a few details, John, but this is at a community college, we're told, in Roseburg, which is a town in a rural area just south of Eugene in Oregon. The numbers that we're hearing at the moment, police have confirmed that there are 15 dead, more than 20 people have been injured. As we were saying, a community college, so no doubt involving young people, 1,000 students at that college. So yes, as you say, a devastating event, another devastating event involving guns inside small-town America.
Kylie, for the moment, thank you very much from the capital there. That's all from Channel 4 News this evening. You can pick up online with that story and more. We're back tomorrow at 7. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.